I had a very core childhood experience with horror games that kind of set me off on the wrong foot. My cousin, which in hindsight I think I did this on purpose, left Resident Evil 1 on his PlayStation in the living room when he wasn't there. And me being the cheeky little passionate gamer, even as a kid, I really wanted to play his PlayStation. So somehow I convinced my sister to join me on this. We booted up the PlayStation to literally play whatever was in it, which happened to be Resident Evil 1. I believe at the time I would have been 8 years old, way too young to be playing anything of the sort. But I was determined to play the fancy new PlayStation that my cousin had that I didn't have yet. So we boot it up, we play up to a certain very famous point where you see the first terrifying CG zombie ever. It looks really crude and silly now, but back then, oh my God. And my sister and I just scream at the top of our lungs. And I, in my fight or flight response, I fought towards the power button, which was right under the TV, and I slammed that power button as hard as I could, making everything go away. That was my first experience with a horror game, and it really soured my ability to enjoy it for probably most of my adult life. And it didn't help that throughout my childhood, there were moments that my parents or people that were taking care of me would then show me other horror things, which again, I was probably too young to even process or understand, but they were terrifying. And they weren't just, oh, cute little horror movies that had some scary elements. They were like crazy, Japanese ass horror movies that were way too scary. Like The Grudge before they remade it with Sarah Michelle Gellar. Like The Ring. I remember growing up, The Ring was kind of this weird movie that I was just really afraid of. There was a good lore and legend to it that was like, oh, if you watch this, you're going to be really messed up. And I was the kind of person where all of this horror stuff would linger with me for a while. If it was a psychological thing, it would stay with me. It would make me think about it. And I would think, oh, this thing that I watch is totally out to get me. Very overactive imagination. I think in pictures, it probably wasn't good for me. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, I think I knew that there was a hint of fun in something being able to do that to you. But I wasn't really mature enough to realize it at the time. So for most of my life, I think, probably up until in my 20s, I avoided most horror things. Most horror things were probably too scary for me. I had little beats where I would explore and try to find out what things I may or may not like. But I think there's one thing I knew for sure, that jump scares were not it. And jump scares were the thing that would always trick me, whether it's the weird comic book website thing that's famous for, like, if you scroll down enough, the doll kind of jumps out at you, or those weird exe things that would go on your computer, and if you start it, it's just a background program that occasionally would jump scare you on your PC unless you end the progress, and it just became this invisible, terrifying app that was on your PC. That was my experience, probably up to the point where I purposely started reaching out for horror experiences again. Cheap jump scares that just got you so good. It was all about shock value in the early internet. And again, soured my experience with horror things at that time without realizing that there was a plethora, a spectrum of amazing psychological horror that touches you to the core in a way that is unsettling, that I was missing out on. And for video games, I kind of dabble. Resident Evil 4, I played on the PS2. It was a game that was really revolutionary at the time. And when it came out on the PS2, I got it. I played through it. I was terrified the whole time. It was full of tension, but it was that perfect flow state middle ground where it was just kind of scary enough and it was just tense enough. And without realizing it, because I would be trying to play it very well, that made the game more tense for me because that game had an invisible difficulty scaler. So it always kept you in this weird state of flow. It was never too hard for you, but it was never too easy for you. It was exactly where your skill level was. And that, while made it very engaging, also made it very tense and terrifying. But I remember that experience was probably the first touch of, there's probably something here of substance that I enjoy that I'm figuring out slowly. And of course, I would dabble. Like a game like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, when that came out, that was kind of a little unique thing with PewDiePie blowing up with reacting to that game. And it would go on sale constantly, so it became something that I tried to go into. That was too scary back then when that game came out. I just couldn't handle it. It was too much tension. And again, very overactive imagination to be able to do any of that. I think nowadays I could handle it pretty easily, but I don't quote me on that. I reserve the right to take that back at any time. You did have a lot of games with horror elements in them. You have stuff like Dead Space, which is technically survival horror, but they gave you such a strong gun that it's a bit of a mixed bag there. You have stuff like The Last of Us, which you could probably say is survival horror, but in my brain, it doesn't feel that way. So I was slowly being able to numb myself out to just elements of games that had survival horror elements that I really saw no problem going into. Then I kind of hit a little bit of a gaming drought. I kind of seen too much. I started working in the industry. I was tasting a lot of different games with adult money. I had the ability to kind of poke at everything, and everything was starting to become a little bit homogenous and the same. And it becomes a point in time where if you're a game enthusiast, you start waiting for the big bangers to drop over playing everything. And so that's kind of when I picked up Resident Evil 7. That was probably right past the line of what I could handle when I played Resident Evil 7, but it looked really good. It looked promising. It was well reviewed. It went back to its core roots because I played Resident Evil 5 and 6, and those were clearly action games without really horror elements. So 7 came out from a franchise that I really enjoyed, and I couldn't help myself. I couldn't just skip it. And so that was the first time in my experience where I had to just play it scared, and I got through it. Did I remember what happened? No. Was the act of playing Resident Evil 7 just for me to get through it? Just to say that I could do that? Yes. And along the way, I found a weird appreciation for it. I discovered that games were kind of the only thing that you can practice doing something scared in the most safe environment, because there's many things in life that you would have to do scared. And I was really appreciative of being able to do that within a video game. There are so many moments you're standing in a dark doorway, staring at it, and you have to walk forward, and all of this fear comes up and you have to just go. The fact that a piece of media can force me to do that, I found beautiful. I found it was glorious in its own right. And I kind of learned certain things about the horror things that make me tick. The actual thing that is scaring you isn't ever the thing that's actually scary. To me, it was the anticipation or the tension of the scare happening that I actually found more scary than the actual thing. So a lot of times when I got scared, I learned to push forward. If I was literally too terrified to move, I would purposely die to the thing that would scare me, because it was triggering such a primal fight or flight response, and I had to learn to fight instead of flight or freeze. And part of that fight was just, I'm scared of this thing. Let's run right into it, get the scare out of the way so that I can come back with a very generous checkpoint and redo that again, a little bit less scared of that thing. There's other little things that the idea of being chased by something that you can barely see is also something that I discovered that was more scary than the actual thing itself. You see a lot of silly games with silly horror elements that aren't really out to aggressively be scary in itself. If you look at something that's scary for too long, you kind of notice it's a little bit silly, but the imagination doesn't work that way. The imagination has the ability to make something seem worse than it really is. So I was playing with that too, and realizing that this is a skill that I can bring to real life for many other things. There's plenty of times in real life, completely unrelated to a horror thing, where I'm afraid to do something and I have to do it anyway. So dealing with that little pocket of emotion and having a video game be the thing that makes me, okay, I'm so scared, but I have to do it. That was a really cool thing to push through, to learn about, to figure out about myself, and I'm so appreciative of it. Weirdly, the game that scared me the most throughout this whole journey of learning to like horror games was Doki Doki Literature Club. I found out deep-seated psychological horror that sits with you for a very long time that isn't really overtly terrifying was way more terrifying. When a game was trying to reach out of the game to talk to the player and instill kind of a fear into you, the user, the player, that's the kind of stuff that stuck with me way more than overtly scary things that were meant to just give you a nice little bop. And I think those games I still have a problem with. Those games that take your expectation of what something is and completely subvert that and push it back on the player. And some of the scariest things in that game were when it broke the game's rule, when it would crash on its own, when the character would show up in front of the UI. It's stuff that doesn't really make sense in the context of the game format itself. And so it's really smart when a game knows how to push those buttons in a way that really hits you. It feels like the game is turning on you. That's why all those creepy pastas work. You know, the ones that talk about like a cursed cartridge, like Pokemon Black or a Ben Drown are two really famous ones. Those are really scary little stories because they take a memory, something that is innocent, games that I really, really enjoyed and love, and they twist it in a sick way that messes with my expectations, messes with what I think is supposed to happen. And for some reason, that kind of fear gets deep into this. There are some games that I straight up can't play, like a Phasmophobia. Something I always used to say is that I don't like when games have ghosts because ghosts don't have rules. There's no rule set for what a ghost can do. A ghost by nature can disappear and reappear anywhere, which means the whole time the tension is extremely high and insane. Or any game that for the majority of the game, they take away your weapon. That's still a little bit tough for me, especially in moments where they do give you weapons and then they strip them away. Like there's a moment in Resident Evil 8 that does that. Really well-known mansion sequence. And that got me so much. I was so brave up until that point, and it just became this like, oh no. They took everything away and I have to do this PT-esque thing with a very disgusting monster at the end. It's just so perfectly dark and ominous, and it really got my imagination going, especially thinking that I was safe the whole time up to this point and then flipping that on its head. Beautiful stuff. The ultimate test for me was I got to play Silent Hill 2, the remake, and in an extension, Alan Wake 2. Those two kind of sit in the same realm as me. Silent Hill 2 is a little bit scarier in atmosphere. In a sense, I find both of their experience to be relatively similar in the modern day. I think I got through those relatively fine, but if you gun to my head, if you asked me what those stories are really about, I'd probably be a little lost. I was wrecked with tension the entire time I was playing those games, but they were fun. I've learned to push into the fear, and that part of the experience is the fun for me now. And you don't have to do this like perfectly. Everybody recommends that you wear loud headphones, you play completely in pitch black darkness. If you can't do that, but you do want to play these games, you don't have to do this extreme hard mode. You can work up to it at some point, but don't be afraid to play with a light on. Don't be afraid to play during the day, because there is a certain point where it's too scary for you to continue, but you want to play. That's ridiculous to try to force yourself to be too scared. If you're too scared, it's just not fun. It's like horror games in VR. You can't escape. You have to close your eyes, but it's still 3D all around you. Doing this actually just turns your head in the game, so you're kind of still engaged in the game. Keep your thumb on the pause button. Like, don't be afraid to take advantage of things and make it a little bit less scary. But also, if you're up to it, if you're down for it, let the fear flow right through you. Feel the spike of that adrenaline when you get scared, and then you realize you can kind of laugh it off and go, okay, okay. And then you let the tension build up again really slowly, and then you get that big scare, and then you kind of go back down again in the cycle over and over again. And there is fun to that. It is a feeling like any other feeling that you would feel watching anything, playing anything, but it's one that you're not used to. And when you get used to it, it's like getting a little stim pack that's triggered by such a human response. And through all that, I really found a way to just appreciate horror elements in games. And in some ways, I hope that helps you too. If you're on the fence, missing out, some great stories and great games happen there. But that's all I got today, and I hope in any way this was helpful to you. If you enjoyed this video at all, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps a lot as a small-time creator. Otherwise, that's all I got. I'll see you next time. Peace.